Hey folks, I know I am just an old guy telling stories, but please leave a like and subscribe before we start. Let's enjoy in today's stories. I spend way too much time online, especially on the dark web. I know it's risky, but the thrill of finding hidden stuff is addicting. A few months ago, I found this weird thread titled Temporal Equations: Unlock the Secrets of Time Travel. It sounded like complete nonsense, but I was curious. The post was by someone called Chronomaster, and it was filled with crazy complex math equations and strange explanations. I have a bit of a background in math from college before I dropped out, so some of it actually made sense to me. I felt this weird pull like I had to understand it. I downloaded all the files and started digging in. I became obsessed. I barely ate or slept, just sat at my desk surrounded by printouts and notes. My place turned into a disaster zone. I didn't care, I just wanted to crack those equations. After about 2 weeks of nonstop work, I had a breakthrough. I figured out the main equation, and it seemed to describe a way to mess with time itself. It sounded insane even to me, but it felt right. I needed to test it, but I didn't have the right equipment. That's when I called Mark, an old friend from college who works at a high-tech lab. I was nervous about involving him, but I had no choice. I told him about my discovery, leaving out the dark web part. To my surprise, he was intrigued and agreed to help me. We set up the experiment late at night in his lab. We used a wristwatch as our test subject and followed the equation's instructions. When we activated the device, the air around the watch seemed to ripple for a second. Then it was over, and the watch was gone. We both stared at the empty table, not believing what we just saw. Had we really done it? We spent the next few days running more tests, documenting everything. Each time, the objects would disappear and then reappear a few moments later, totally unchanged. Word about our experiment started spreading, even though we tried to keep it quiet. Mark was excited about publishing our findings, but I was getting nervous. Something felt off. The equations, the perfect results, it was all too good to be true. And then, weird stuff started happening. At first, I just felt like I was being watched. I'd see the same black car parked near my place or notice unfamiliar faces in the crowd. I thought I was just being paranoid from all the stress and lack of sleep. But then one night, I came home to find my apartment trashed. Papers were everywhere, my computer was smashed, and the hard drives were gone. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were looking for. I tried calling Mark, but he didn't answer. When I went to his place, it was the same story. Everything destroyed, and Mark was missing. I reported the break-ins to the police, but they were no help. They thought it was just random burglaries. They had no clue about the real danger. I decided to go into hiding, moving from one cheap motel to another, always looking over my shoulder. The feeling of being hunted got stronger every day. I started getting creepy messages on my phone, telling me to stop my research. They were anonymous and they knew everything about me. My routine, my friends, even my fears. One night, as I was walking back to my motel, I felt a sharp pain in my side. I fell and saw a shadowy figure running away. I realized I had been stabbed. I managed to crawl back to the motel, and the night clerk called an ambulance. The wound was bad, but not deadly. The police again dismissed it as a random attack, but I knew better. It was a warning. As I lay in the hospital bed, recovering from surgery, I realized just how deep I was in. The equations were more than just theory. They were the key to something huge and dangerous. And now, powerful people wanted them, and me, gone. After I got out of the hospital, things went from bad to worse. I knew I couldn't go back to my apartment, so I crashed at a friend's place for a few days. I tried to lay low, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Mark was still missing, and I had no idea who was after me or why. I started noticing more and more people watching me. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched anymore. I actually saw them. They were everywhere, on the street, in cafes, even outside my friend's apartment. I couldn't trust anyone. One night I decided to confront one of them. It was a guy who had been hanging around my friend's building for a few days. I walked up to him and asked what he wanted. He acted like he didn't know what I was talking about, but his eyes gave him away. He knew exactly who I was. Before I could push further, he walked away quickly and disappeared into the crowd. I knew I had to get out of town. I packed a bag with some essentials and hit the road, heading for a city where I knew no one. I figured I could blend in better in a place where I had no connections. I found a cheap motel on the outskirts and checked in under a fake name. For a while it seemed to work. I stayed off the grid, using cash for everything and avoiding places with security cameras. But it wasn't long before they found me again. I woke up one night to the sound of someone trying to pick the lock on my motel room door. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, then quietly slipped out the window and ran. I wandered the streets for hours, trying to figure out my next move. I couldn't keep running forever. I needed to know who was after me and why. I decided to go back to the dark web forums where I found the equations in the first place. Maybe there was more information there, something I had missed. I found an internet cafe and logged in under a new identity. I searched for any mentions of Chronomaster or the temporal equations. After hours of digging, I found a thread that seemed promising. It was a discussion about the dangers of time manipulation and the people who would do anything to control it. The posts were filled with horror stories about people who had tried to use the equations and had disappeared or worse. Some claimed that powerful organizations, possibly even governments, were behind the disappearances. They wanted to control time travel technology, and anyone who got too close to the truth was a threat. I realized then that I was in way over my head. These weren't just random stalkers. These were professional operatives, maybe even assassins. I needed help, but I didn't know who to trust. I decided to reach out to an old hacker friend, Alex. If anyone could help me navigate this mess, it was him. I sent Alex an encrypted message explaining my situation and asking for his help. He responded quickly, telling me to meet him at a safe house he had set up outside the city. It was a risk, but I didn't have many options left. When I got to the safe house, Alex was already there, setting up his gear. He looked at me with a mix of concern and curiosity. I told him everything, from finding the equations to the break-ins, the stalking, and the stabbing. He listened without interrupting, then nodded slowly. "This is serious," he said. "These people mean business. But I think I can help you. First, we need to get rid of any tracking devices they might have planted on you." We spent the next few hours combing through my belongings and scanning for bugs. Alex found 2 trackers, one in my phone and another in the lining of my backpack. He destroyed them both and set up new, secure communication channels for us. Over the next few days, Alex and I worked together to dig deeper into the dark web. He used his skills to trace the origins of the messages I had received and to gather intel on the people behind the attacks. We discovered that Chronomaster was actually a front for a shadowy organization that had been experimenting with time travel for years. The more we uncovered, the more dangerous it became. We were constantly on the move, changing locations every few days to stay ahead of our pursuers. But despite the danger, I felt a strange sense of purpose. I was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. After weeks of dodging, hiding, and gathering intel, Alex and I finally got a break. We managed to trace one of the encrypted messages back to a physical location, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was risky, but we knew we had to investigate. We spent the next few days planning our approach. Alex hacked into the warehouse's security system and managed to get a layout of the building. It was heavily guarded, but we noticed a few weak points we could exploit. We decided to go in at night, when security was likely to be lighter. The night of the operation, my heart was pounding. We parked a few blocks away and made our way to the warehouse on foot. Alex disabled the security cameras and we slipped inside through a side entrance. The place was massive, filled with crates and high-tech equipment. It looked like a scene straight out of a spy movie. We moved quietly, sticking to the shadows, and made our way to the central office. Alex hacked the door and we slipped inside. The room was filled with monitors and computers, all showing various feeds and data streams. On one of the desks, we found a folder with the Chronomaster logo on it. Inside were detailed plans and reports on the time travel experiments. We quickly scanned the documents. They confirmed our worst fears. This organization was far more advanced and dangerous than we had imagined. They had been experimenting with time travel for years, and anyone who got too close to their secrets was eliminated. As we were going through the papers, we heard footsteps approaching. We hid behind a row of filing cabinets just as the door opened. Two men walked in discussing something about a recent problem they needed to deal with. My blood ran cold when I realized they were talking about me. They mentioned my name, and I knew we had to act fast. Alex and I exchanged a look, and he nodded. We needed to get out of there, but not before gathering as much evidence as we could. Alex quickly copied the data from the computers onto a flash drive while I kept watch. Just as he finished, the men turned to leave. We waited until the coast was clear, then slipped out of the office and headed for the exit. But as we were about to leave, an alarm sounded. We had been detected. We ran through the maze of crates and equipment, heading for the side entrance. Security guards were closing in from all sides. Alex used his skills to disable a few of them, but we were outnumbered. Just as it seemed we were cornered, Alex spotted an emergency exit. We burst through the door and sprinted into the night, dodging bullets and shouts. We didn't stop until we reached our car. We jumped in and sped away, our hearts racing. We had the evidence, but now they knew we were onto them. Back at the safe house, we went through the data we had collected. It was a gold mine, detailed records of their experiments, names of key operatives, and locations of other facilities. We knew we had to get this information to the authorities, but we couldn't trust just anyone. Alex suggested reaching out to a journalist he knew, someone who had a reputation for exposing government corruption and corporate malfeasance. It was a long shot, but it was our best bet. We arranged a meeting and handed over the flash drive, explaining everything that had happened. The journalist was skeptical at first, but as he went through the data, his expression changed. He agreed to look into it and promised to keep us informed. We knew it would take time for him to verify everything and publish the story, but at least we had a plan. For the next few days, we laid low, waiting for any news. It was a tense time, but we knew we had done everything we could. Then one morning, Alex received a call from the journalist. The story was going live, and it was going to be big. The next day, headlines across the country were filled with the expose. The dark web time travel experiments, the disappearances, the shadowy organization. It was all out in the open. Authorities launched investigations and arrests were made. But it wasn't over for us. We knew that even with the exposure, the people behind this wouldn't just disappear. They would regroup and they would come after us. But for now, we had a moment of relief. We had survived, and we had made a difference. As I sat in the safe house, reflecting on everything that had happened, I knew my life would never be the same. The discovery had changed everything, but it had also shown me the strength I didn't know I had. And with Alex by my side, I knew I could face whatever came next. The fallout from the expose was massive. News outlets picked up the story, and social media was ablaze with discussions about time travel and secret organizations. It felt like a victory, but Alex and I knew it was only temporary. The people we were up against wouldn't give up easily. The first sign of trouble came just 2 days after the story broke. Alex's secure network picked up chatter, indicating that our location might have been compromised. We couldn't risk staying in the safe house any longer. We packed our bags and hit the road again, heading for a new hideout Alex had set up in a remote area. As we drove through the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every car that appeared in our rearview mirror seemed like a threat. We took multiple detours and switched vehicles twice to throw off any potential followers. By the time we reached the new hideout, we were both exhausted. The new place was even more secluded than the last one, a small cabin in the woods with no neighbors for miles. It was the perfect spot to lay low for a while. Alex set up his equipment, and we began monitoring the news and any online chatter about us. Despite the initial wave of media attention, things started to quiet down. The authorities were investigating, but there were no major breakthroughs. It seemed like the organization was regrouping, and we had no idea what their next move would be. One night, as I was sitting outside the cabin trying to clear my mind, I heard a noise in the woods. At first I thought it was just an animal, but the sound grew louder, closer. I signaled to Alex and we both grabbed our weapons. We had prepared for this, but the reality of facing armed intruders was terrifying. We took our positions and waited. The footsteps were getting closer and my heart was pounding. Then out of the darkness a figure emerged. It was a man, and he was alone. He raised his hands, showing he was unarmed. "I'm here to help," he said in a low voice. "My name is Jack. I've been following your story." Alex and I exchanged a look, unsure whether to trust him, but something about his demeanor seemed genuine. We cautiously let him inside, and he explained his situation. Jack was a former member of the organization, but he had turned against them when he realized the extent of their plans. "They're not just interested in time travel," Jack said. "They're looking to control it, to rewrite history for their own gain. They won't stop until they have complete power." He offered us valuable intel, locations of other safe houses, names of key operatives, and, most importantly, a plan to bring down the organization from the inside. It was risky, but it was our best shot. Over the next few days, we worked closely with Jack, planning our next move. We needed to strike at the heart of the organization, to cut off its head and watch the rest fall apart. Jack's information led us to a central hub in a nearby city, where the top leaders operated. We prepared carefully, gathering all the tools and weapons we might need. Alex hacked into their systems, creating diversions and disabling security where possible. Jack used his insider knowledge to guide us through the plan. The night before the operation, we went over everything one last time. The next day, we moved out. The hub was located in an unassuming office building, heavily guarded but with weak points we could exploit. We entered through a maintenance tunnel that Jack had used before. It led us directly into the basement, bypassing most of the security. Once inside, we split up. Alex went to disable the remaining security systems, Jack went to gather evidence, and I was tasked with confronting the leaders. The plan was to corner them and force a confession, to get them to admit their plans on record. As I made my way through the building, my nerves were on edge. Every corner, every closed door felt like a potential ambush. But we had timed everything perfectly. I reached the main office just as Alex cut the power, plunging the building into darkness. Using night vision goggles, I slipped inside. The leaders were in a meeting, caught off guard by the sudden blackout. I approached them, weapon drawn, and demanded they explain their plans. They were defiant at first, but when I played the recording of Jack's testimony, their faces changed. "We'll confess," one of them said, realizing they had no way out. "But it won't stop anything. There are others, and they'll continue our work." I recorded their confession, making sure to capture every detail. With the evidence in hand, we made our way back to the exit. Alex restored the power just as we left the building, leaving behind a trail of confusion and chaos. We handed the recordings over to the journalist, who promised to release them to the public. This time, there was no going back. The organization's secrets were exposed, and their plans were ruined. We had won a major battle, but the war was far from over. As we regrouped at our new hideout, I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. We had struck a major blow, but I knew the organization wouldn't give up easily. They would come after us with everything they had. But for now, we had each other, and we had a plan. We were ready to keep fighting, no matter the cost. The release of the recordings caused an uproar. The media frenzy was even bigger this time, with investigations and public outcry putting immense pressure on the authorities to act. The organization was exposed, their plans laid bare for the world to see. But Alex, Jack, and I knew our victory was temporary. The organization was wounded but not dead. We decided to go on the offensive. Jack had one last piece of critical information. a hidden lab where the core of their time travel research was conducted. Destroying this lab would cripple their operations for good. It was located in a remote facility, heavily guarded and nearly impenetrable. We spent days preparing. Alex worked tirelessly to hack into their systems, creating fake identities and access codes. Jack gathered supplies and weapons, while I mapped out our approach. This was it, the final stand. The night of the operation, we moved under the cover of darkness. We reached the facility undetected, thanks to Alex's hacked access codes. As we approached the main entrance, my heart raced. This was the most dangerous thing we had ever attempted. Inside, the facility was a maze of corridors and labs. We moved quickly, avoiding patrols and surveillance cameras. Alex guided us through the layout he had memorized, leading us to the central lab where the time travel research was conducted. We breached the lab's security with minimal resistance thanks to Alex's skills and Jack's insider knowledge. Inside, we found the heart of their operation: massive machines, servers filled with data, and a handful of scientists working frantically. They were caught off guard, clearly not expecting an attack. "Step away from the equipment," Jack shouted, his weapon drawn. The scientists complied, fear evident on their faces. We planted explosives around the lab, ensuring we would destroy everything. As we worked, I couldn't help but think about how far we'd come. From a single dark web post to this moment, it felt surreal. But there was no time for reflection. We had to move fast. With the explosive set, we made our way to the exit. But as we reached the door, alarms blared throughout the facility. We had been discovered. Guards poured in from every direction, and a fierce firefight erupted. Alex and Jack held them off while I finished setting the final charges. "Go, I'll cover you," Jack yelled, his eyes fierce with determination. We didn't have time to argue. Alex and I ran towards the exit, gunfire echoing behind us. As we reached the outside, the ground shook with the force of the explosions. The facility went up in flames, a massive fireball lighting up the night sky. We made it to our getaway vehicle, driving away as fast as we could. But Jack was not with us. We drove in silence, the weight of our loss heavy on our hearts. Jack had sacrificed himself to give us a chance to escape, to ensure the mission's success. His bravery and dedication had made this victory possible. In the aftermath, the organization's remnants were rounded up by the authorities. The destruction of their lab was a crippling blow, one they wouldn't recover from easily. The public was informed about the full extent of their plans, and global efforts were launched to prevent anything like this from happening again. Alex and I went our separate ways, knowing that we had to disappear for good. We had done what we set out to do, but the danger was never truly gone. I changed my identity and moved to a different country, hoping to start a new life far from the chaos. Even now, I still look over my shoulder, always wary of who might be watching. But I carry the memory of our fight, and the knowledge that we made a difference. Jack's sacrifice, Alex's skills, and my determination had stopped something truly terrifying. I don't know what the future holds, but for now, I can live with the hope that our actions have made the world a safer place. And I will always remember the cost of that safety and the friends I lost along the way. I've always been fascinated by the occult. I guess it started with those late-night horror movie marathons, the kind that leave you feeling like something's lurking in the shadows, long after the credits roll. My best friend Mark shared my curiosity. We were inseparable, always seeking out the next thrill, the next unexplained mystery. So when we stumbled upon the dark web, it felt like we had found a treasure trove of forbidden secrets. It was a Friday night, the kind where the world felt both eerily still and brimming with potential. Mark and I were holed up in my room, the only light coming from the glow of my computer screen. We were several pages deep into the dark web, scrolling past illegal weapons, stolen credit cards, and bizarrely human organs. And then we saw it. Authentic Ouija board. Connect with the other side. Guaranteed. Dude, we have to get this, Mark said, his eyes wide with excitement. He was always the impulsive one, ready to jump into anything head first. I was more cautious, but the idea intrigued me. We had dabbled with homemade Ouija boards before, but they never seemed to work. This one promised to be different. It was described as handcrafted from cursed wood, used in rituals by ancient cults. I hesitated. What if it's dangerous? Mark laughed. That's the point, man. What's life without a little danger? We pooled our money together and placed the order. The delivery estimate was vague, promising arrival within a week. We shut down the computer and tried to sleep, but the anticipation was too much. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts about what might happen once we got our hands on that board. The days dragged on, each one longer than the last. We checked my mailbox obsessively, but there was no sign of our package. Finally, a small, nondescript box arrived on my doorstep. My heart raced as I brought it inside. Mark came over immediately. We opened the box together, and inside, wrapped in black cloth, was the Ouija board. It looked old, really old. The wood was dark and worn, the letters carved deep and filled with something red. Blood? I shivered at the thought. There was a note included. Use with caution. The spirits are not always friendly. We laughed it off, attributing it to a marketing gimmick. That night, we set the board on the floor of my room, lit some candles, and dimmed the lights. The air felt thick with anticipation. Mark placed his fingers on the planchette. Is anyone here with us? At first, nothing happened. We exchanged a nervous glance. Then slowly, the planchette began to move. My heart pounded in my chest. I could feel Mark's fingers trembling under mine. Y-E-S. We stared at each other in shock. Who are you? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The planchette moved again, faster this time. D-A-T-H. My breath caught in my throat. This has to be a joke, I muttered, trying to convince myself. But Mark's face was pale. I don't think it is. The planchette continued to move, spelling out a message. W-E-A-R-E-C-O-M-I-N-G. A chill ran down my spine. Who's coming? There was a long pause, then S-A-C-R-I-F-I-C-E. I pulled my hands away, shaking. This isn't funny anymore, Mark. He looked just as scared as I felt. I'm not doing this. It's real. We decided to end the session. I threw the board back into the box and shoved it under my bed, but the feeling of dread lingered. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump. I kept expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. The next day, things got worse. Mark called me, his voice panicked. I think someone's following me. What? Who? I don't know. I was walking home from work, and I kept seeing this guy. He was wearing a hood, just standing there watching me. I tried to reassure him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Later that night, I heard noises outside my window. I looked out, and there was someone standing across the street, cloaked in darkness, watching my house. The days turned into a blur of fear. We started seeing them everywhere. Hooded figures, always watching, never approaching. We didn't dare go to the police. What could we say? That we were being stalked by a cult because we bought a Ouija board on the dark web. Mark and I decided to meet up and figure out what to do. We were sitting in my room, the Ouija board between us, when we heard it. A soft, rhythmic chanting coming from outside. We looked out the window and saw them, a group of people, their faces hidden under hoods, standing in a circle around my house. What do they want? I whispered. Mark shook his head. I don't know, but we need to get out of here. We packed a few essentials and slipped out the back door. The chanting grew louder as we ran. We had no plan, no idea where to go. All we knew was that we had to get away. As we ran through the dark streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded, pushed toward something. We ended up in an old abandoned warehouse. The place was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of decay. "We'll hide here for now," Mark said, his voice trembling. We found a corner and huddled together, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The chanting had stopped, but the silence was even more terrifying. It felt like the calm before a storm. That's when we heard it, a soft whisper right next to my ear. "You can't escape." I jumped, looking around wildly, but there was no one there. Mark grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding. "What do we do?" He looked at the Ouija board still clutched in his hands. "We need to destroy it. Maybe that will stop them." We found a metal barrel and some old newspapers. Mark set the papers on fire and threw the board into the flames. We watched as the wood blackened and curled, the letters burning away. For a moment I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe it was over. But then, the chanting started again, louder this time, coming from all around us. The warehouse filled with shadows, figures emerging from the darkness, their faces hidden under hoods. "You can't run," one of them said, his voice a low growl. "The ritual must be completed." Mark and I backed away, our hearts racing. "What do you want from us?" I shouted. The figure stepped forward, pulling back his hood. His face was pale, eyes dark and empty. "Your souls. You have opened the gate, and now you must pay the price." We turned and ran, but there was nowhere to go. The warehouse was a maze of corridors and dead ends. The chanting grew louder, echoing off the walls. I could feel them closing in, their cold breath on my neck. We burst through a door and found ourselves on the roof. The cold night air hit us like a slap, but we kept running. There was a fire escape on the side of the building. We scrambled down, our hands slipping on the rusted metal. When we reached the ground, we didn't stop. We ran until our legs gave out, collapsing in a deserted alley. The chanting had stopped, but we knew they were still out there watching, waiting. "We can't stay here," Mark said, his voice shaking. "We need to find a way to stop them." But how do you stop something like this? We had unleashed something dark and terrible, and now it was coming for us. The fear was like a weight in my chest, suffocating me. We decided to keep moving, never staying in one place for too long. But no matter where we went, they always found us. The hooded figures, the whispers, the chanting. It was like a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. And that's when I realized the truth. There was no escape. We had crossed a line, and now we were trapped, running from a darkness that would never let us go. We barely slept. Every time we closed our eyes, we heard the chanting, felt their presence creeping closer. It was like they were toying with us, letting us think we had a chance to escape before pulling us back into their grip. Mark and I decided we needed help. But who could we turn to? Our families wouldn't believe us, and the police would probably think we were insane. In our desperation, we reached out to an old acquaintance, someone we hadn't seen in years but who had dabbled in the occult even deeper than we had. Her name was Emily, a high school friend turned occult enthusiast. She had always been a bit eccentric, collecting strange artifacts and books on dark magic. We found her living in a small, cluttered apartment filled with candles, crystals, and dusty tomes. When we explained our situation, her eyes widened, but she didn't look surprised. "You two have really messed up," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Those aren't just spirits you're dealing with. You've attracted the attention of a cult that worships something much darker." We told her about the Ouija board, the chanting, the hooded figures. She listened intently, then nodded. "You've opened a door to something that shouldn't be crossed. The board was just a conduit. The real power comes from the ritual they're trying to complete." "Is there any way to stop them?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. Emily sighed. "There's a way, but it's dangerous. You need to sever the connection you've made, and that means performing a counter-ritual. But it won't be easy. The cult will do everything they can to stop you." We spent the next few days gathering the necessary items for the ritual. Emily gave us a list: salt, black candles, a silver knife, and a book of ancient incantations. Each item seemed to radiate a sense of foreboding, a tangible reminder of the danger we were in. The nights were the worst. We could hear them outside, the chanting growing louder, more insistent. Mark and I took turns keeping watch, but sleep was elusive. Every creak, every shadow sent us into a panic. On the night of the ritual, we went to an old abandoned church on the outskirts of town. The place was decrepit, with broken stained glass windows and rotting pews. It felt like the kind of place where evil things happened. Emily set up the candles in a circle and sprinkled the salt around us. The silver knife glinted ominously in the candlelight. "Once we start, we can't stop," she warned. "No matter what happens, you must keep chanting the incantation." We nodded, our hearts pounding. The air was thick with anticipation, and a sense of impending doom hung over us. Emily began the ritual, chanting in a language I didn't understand. Mark and I joined in, our voices shaky but determined. The candles flickered, and the air grew colder, as if something was being drawn to us. And then we heard them, the chanting outside the church, the hooded figures surrounding the building. They pounded on the doors, the windows, their voices rising in a terrifying crescendo. "Keep chanting," Emily shouted over the noise. I tried to focus on the words, but my mind was racing. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath forming clouds in front of me. The shadows seemed to move, creeping closer, trying to break the circle. The doors burst open and the hooded figures poured in. They moved with an unnatural speed, their faces hidden in darkness. I could feel their eyes on us, their hatred palpable. Mark's voice faltered, and he looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "I can't do this, man." "Yes, you can," I shouted, grabbing his hand. "We have to." Emily's voice grew louder, more desperate. The figures were closing in, their chanting mixing with ours in a cacophony of sound. I could feel their cold hands reaching for us, trying to pull us out of the circle. The candles flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The only light came from the moon shining through the broken windows. I could see the figures more clearly now, their faces twisted in hatred, their eyes burning with an unholy light. Emily's voice was the only thing keeping me anchored. I kept chanting, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur, and I could feel something dark and malevolent pressing down on us. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The figures vanished, the chanting ceased, and the oppressive weight lifted. The candles flickered back to life, casting a dim, reassuring glow. We collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Emily looked at us, her face pale but determined. "It's not over. They'll come back. But for now, you're safe." I looked at Mark, his face pale and drawn. "What do we do now?" Emily sighed. "We find a way to end this once and for all, but first we need to rest. We'll need all our strength for what's coming." We spent the rest of the night in the church, too exhausted to move. The darkness outside felt impenetrable, but for the first time in days I felt a glimmer of hope. We had survived the night, and with Emily's help, maybe we had a chance to end this nightmare. But deep down, I knew the worst was yet to come. The next morning, we awoke to a grim realization. Our ordeal was far from over. The safety we felt in the old church was fleeting, and the sense of dread quickly returned. Emily was already up, poring over her ancient books, her eyes dark with worry. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," she said, not looking up from the pages. "This cult, they're not just trying to scare you. They need your souls to complete their ritual." Mark and I exchanged a worried glance. "Why us?" I asked. Emily sighed, finally lifting her gaze. "You were the ones who opened the door. By using that Ouija board, you invited them in. Now they see you as the perfect sacrifices." Her words sent a chill down my spine. The reality of our situation was sinking in. We weren't just running from some crazed cultists. We were running from a force that wanted to drag us into hell. We decided to leave the church, feeling it was no longer safe. Emily suggested we go to an old cabin her family owned, deep in the woods. It was remote, hard to find, and she believed it would give us some time to figure out our next move. The journey to the cabin was nerve-wracking. We kept looking over our shoulders, expecting to see hooded figures emerging from the trees. Every rustle, every snap of a twig set our nerves on edge. The woods felt alive with malevolent energy, as if the trees themselves were watching us. When we finally reached the cabin, it was a welcome sight. It was old and decrepit, but it felt like a fortress compared to the open vulnerability of the woods. Emily set to work immediately, drawing protective symbols around the property and placing wards at the doors and windows. "We should be safe here, at least for a while," she said, though her voice lacked confidence. The first night in the cabin was eerily quiet. We sat around the old wood-burning stove, its warmth a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. Emily explained that the cult was likely performing their own rituals to track us, using dark magic to find our location. "We need to disrupt their connection," she said. "But to do that, we need something that belongs to them, something tied to their rituals." "How do we get that?" Mark asked, his voice tinged with fear. Emily's eyes were hard. "We have to go back to where it started, the place where the Ouija board was made. If we can find any remnants of their rituals, we can use it to break their connection." The thought of returning to the source filled me with dread, but we had no choice. Early the next morning we set out, armed with what little we had. The journey was long and treacherous, taking us to an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. It looked like it had been deserted for years, its windows boarded up, the paint peeling away. We forced our way inside, the air thick with dust and decay. It was like stepping into a tomb. Emily led the way, her eyes scanning for any signs of ritualistic activity. The house felt alive with a dark energy, as if the walls themselves were whispering our arrival. We found what we were looking for in the basement, a makeshift altar covered in dark stains and surrounded by strange symbols. There were remnants of candles, old bones, and a book bound in leather that seemed to pulse with an eerie light. Emily approached the altar, her face set in grim determination. "This is it. We need to destroy this." As she began the process of dismantling the altar, the air grew colder and the house seemed to shudder. We heard footsteps above us, slow and deliberate, like something was moving through the house. "They know we're here," Mark whispered, his face pale. Emily worked faster, chanting under her breath. The book on the altar began to smoke, its pages curling and blackening. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs. I could see a shadow moving in the dim light, getting closer. "Keep them away," Emily shouted. Mark and I moved to block the stairs, our hearts pounding. The shadow took shape, a hooded figure emerging from the darkness. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and a guttural voice filled the room. "You cannot escape your fate," it hissed. I grabbed a piece of wood from the floor and swung it at the figure. It passed through like smoke, but the figure recoiled, as if the intent alone was enough to repel it. Mark did the same, and together we pushed the figure back, buying Emily precious time. The book erupted into flames, the fire spreading to the altar. Emily chanted louder, her voice rising above the roar of the flames. The figure screamed, a horrible, inhuman sound, and dissolved into the shadows. The house began to collapse around us, the walls shaking and the floor buckling. We ran, scrambling up the stairs and out the door just as the building crumbled into a heap of rubble. We stood outside, gasping for breath, covered in dust and sweat. Emily looked at us, her face exhausted but triumphant. "It's done. We've severed their connection." For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope, but deep down I knew our ordeal was far from over. The cult was still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. We returned to the cabin, but the sense of safety was fleeting. The woods were still filled with an oppressive darkness, and every night we heard the distant chanting, growing louder, closer. It was only a matter of time before they found us again, and when they did, we would be ready. We hunkered down in the cabin, trying to regain our strength and prepare for the inevitable next encounter with the cult. Emily's ritual had bought us some time, but we knew it wouldn't be long before they tracked us down again. The woods around the cabin seemed to close in on us, the trees whispering our secrets to the darkness. Mark was the first to crack. The strain of constant fear and sleepless nights took its toll on him. He started having nightmares, waking up screaming about shadows and whispers. I couldn't blame him. I was having the same nightmares, though I tried to hide it. Emily, on the other hand, was relentless. She barely slept, poring over her books, searching for a more permanent solution. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she called us over to the makeshift altar she had set up in the corner of the cabin. "I think I've found something," she said, her eyes glinting with a mix of hope and desperation. "There's a ritual we can perform to banish the cult's influence for good, but it's risky." Mark and I exchanged wary glances. "What kind of risk are we talking about?" I asked. Emily took a deep breath. "We have to summon the entity they worship and bind it. If we succeed, it will break their power over us. But if we fail..." She didn't need to finish. We knew the consequences could be catastrophic. But we were running out of options. The cult was relentless, and our resources were dwindling. "We have to try," Mark said, his voice steadier than it had been in days. "It's our only chance." We spent the next day gathering the final ingredients for the ritual. Emily had a detailed list, including rare herbs, specific stones, and even a vial of our own blood. The last item made my skin crawl, but I understood the necessity. As night fell, we prepared the cabin for the ritual. Emily drew intricate symbols on the floor with salt, setting up candles at precise points around the room. The air was thick with anticipation and fear. "This will draw them here," Emily warned. "We have to be ready for anything." We stood inside the circle, the candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. Emily began to chant, her voice low and rhythmic. Mark and I joined in, our voices blending with hers. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, our breath visible in the cold air. Suddenly, the candles flared, and the symbols on the floor glowed with an eerie light. The air crackled with energy, and a low, guttural growl filled the room. The shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing around us. A figure began to materialize in the center of the circle, a dark, towering presence that radiated malevolence. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "You dare summon me?" it hissed, its voice a blend of 1,000 tortured souls. Emily's voice wavered, but she continued the chant, her eyes locked on the entity. Mark and I followed suit, our voices trembling but determined. The entity roared, its anger palpable, but it was bound by the circle, unable to break free. "We bind you," Emily intoned, her voice gaining strength. "By the power of this circle, we command you to leave us and never return." The entity howled, the sound reverberating through the cabin. The shadows around us lashed out, trying to breach the circle. I felt a cold, slimy touch on my skin, and I fought to keep my focus, chanting louder. The entity's form began to waver, its anger turning to desperation. "You cannot hold me forever," it spat. "I will return, and you will suffer for this." Emily raised the vial of blood and poured it into the center of the circle. The liquid hissed and smoked as it touched the ground, and the entity shrieked, its form dissolving into a cloud of darkness that was sucked into the floor, vanishing from sight. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting from our chests. The candles flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. We stood there panting, our hearts pounding in our ears. "Did it work?" Mark whispered. Emily lit a match, her face illuminated by the small flame. "I think so. We've severed their connection." We collapsed onto the floor, too exhausted to move. The cabin felt different, the air lighter, as if the malevolent presence had finally been banished. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope, but our relief was short-lived. As dawn broke, we heard movement outside the cabin. Peeking through the window, we saw them, the hooded figures, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us. They didn't approach, but their presence was a stark reminder that our fight wasn't over. "They won't give up," Emily said, her voice weary. "But we've weakened them. They can't touch us directly anymore, but they'll try to find another way." We fortified the cabin, preparing for whatever came next. The cult might have been weakened, but they were still out there, a constant threat. We had won a battle, but the war was far from over. Days turned into weeks, and the hooded figures continued to watch us from a distance, never approaching, but never leaving. The tension was unbearable, but we held our ground, determined to outlast them. One night, as we sat by the fire, Emily spoke up. "I've been thinking, we need to go on the offensive. We can't just sit here and wait for them to find another way to get to us." Mark and I nodded. We were tired of living in fear, tired of waiting for the next attack. It was time to end this once and for all. Emily outlined a plan, a final desperate attempt to destroy the cult and their dark power. It would require everything we had, and it would be dangerous. But it was our only chance to end the nightmare that had consumed our lives. And so, we prepared for the final confrontation, knowing that the outcome would determine our fate. We were ready to face the darkness head-on, to fight for our freedom and our souls. The end was in sight, but whether it would be our salvation or our doom remained to be seen. The night of the final confrontation arrived cold and moonless. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, the kind that presses down on you and makes it hard to breathe. We gathered our supplies, knowing this was our last chance to end the nightmare that had consumed our lives. Emily had found a location for the ritual, a clearing deep in the woods, rumored to be a place of ancient power. It was there that we would make our stand. We packed everything we needed into backpacks and set off, the darkness closing in around us as we ventured deeper into the forest. The journey was treacherous, the path barely visible under the dense canopy of trees. We moved in silence, our nerves frayed, every shadow seeming to hide a threat. Finally, we reached the clearing. It was an eerie place, the trees circling it like silent sentinels. The ground was covered in strange symbols, worn away by time but still faintly visible. Emily set up the ritual space, drawing a large circle on the ground with salt and placing black candles at strategic points. In the center, she laid out the items we had gathered: the rare herbs, the specific stones, and the vial of our blood. "This is it," she said, her voice steady but filled with tension. "Once we start, there's no turning back." Mark and I nodded, steeling ourselves for what was to come. We took our positions within the circle, the candles casting long, flickering shadows around us. Emily began to chant, her voice low and resonant, the ancient words echoing through the clearing. As we joined in, the air grew colder, and a thick fog began to seep into the clearing, swirling around us. The symbols on the ground glowed faintly, pulsing with an otherworldly light. We could feel the presence of the cult, their dark energy pressing in on us from all sides. The hooded figures emerged from the trees surrounding the clearing. Their chanting joined ours, a discordant cacophony that filled the air with a palpable sense of dread. They stood just outside the circle, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Emily raised the vial of blood, her voice rising above the din. "We call upon the ancient powers to bind and banish the darkness. We sacrifice our blood to sever the ties that bind us." She poured the blood into the center of the circle, and the ground sizzled and smoked where it touched. The hooded figures screamed, their voices blending into a horrifying wail. The fog thickened, swirling into a vortex above the circle. A figure began to materialize in the vortex, a dark, towering presence that radiated pure evil. It was the entity, summoned once again. But this time, we were prepared. Emily continued to chant, her voice unwavering, as Mark and I held our ground. The entity roared, its form solidifying, eyes blazing with fury. It reached out, but the circle held, the salt and symbols creating a barrier it couldn't breach. Emily's chanting grew louder, the power of her words resonating through the clearing. "We bind you to this place," she shouted, her voice echoing with authority. "By the power of this ritual, we command you to be banished forever." The entity shrieked, its form twisting and writhing as if trying to escape. The ground trembled, the symbols glowing brighter, the vortex pulling the entity back. The hooded figures screamed and dissolved into shadows, their power broken. With a final deafening roar, the entity was sucked into the vortex, which closed with a thunderous clap. The fog dissipated, the air clearing, leaving the night eerily silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we could breathe freely. Emily collapsed to the ground, exhausted but triumphant. "It's over," she whispered. "We did it." Mark and I helped her up, the relief washing over us in waves. The hooded figures were gone, the dark presence banished. We had won. We made our way back to the cabin, the woods now feeling less menacing, the night air crisp and clear. As we approached the cabin, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a warm glow over everything. We sat together in the cabin, too tired to speak, but filled with a sense of peace and accomplishment. The nightmare was over, and we had survived. We knew the scars would remain, but we had faced the darkness and come out the other side. In the days that followed, we dismantled the protective wards and symbols, no longer needing them. Emily stayed with us for a while, helping us adjust to a life free from fear. We knew we would never be the same, but we were stronger, forged by the fire of our ordeal. As I lay in bed that night, the first truly peaceful night in months, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. We had faced unspeakable horrors, but we had triumphed. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that no matter what the future held, we would face it together, unbroken and unafraid.